Please welcome incoming board chair of the Kresge Foundation, Caroline Altman Smith.
Hi, everyone. I'm pleased to be the incoming board chair of Grantmakers for Education. So thank you for having me and looking forward to the next 2 years ahead working with the rest of the board and with Celine and her great staff serving all of you. Item number 1 right now is to welcome our lunchtime plenary speaker, Dr. Sara Goldrick-Rab. Sara is professor of higher education policy and sociology at Temple University and founding director of the Hope Center for College, Community, and Justice in Philadelphia. She is also the chief strategy officer for emergency aid at Equity, a student financial success and emergency aid company, and founded Believe in Students, which is a nonprofit that distributes emergency aid. Goldrick-Rab is best known for her innovative research on food and housing insecurity in higher ed, having led the 4 largest national studies on the subject, and for her work in making public higher education free, which is obviously a very hot topic these days. She is the recipient of the William T. Grant Foundation's Faculty Scholars Award and the Carnegie Fellowship. Her latest book, Paying the Price, College Costs, Financial Aid, and the Betrayal of the American Dream, won the 2018 Grawemeyer Award, but way more importantly, was featured on The Daily Show with Trevor Noah. For those of you who know Sara, she is an accomplished scholar, speaker, social media guru, if you'd like to follow her on Twitter, and unquestionably a fierce advocate for college students. She's the voice of conscience when it comes to encouraging post-secondary institutions to realize that if they are only tending to students' academic lives inside the classroom and not acknowledging and proactively addressing the many barriers that students with low incomes must overcome in order to persist in higher education, then they are missing the boat. The Kresge Foundation, where I'm the Deputy Director of Education, has been pleased to support Sara and her team's work on a range of projects, including an evaluation of a food assistance program at Houston Community College that frames access to food as a scholarship instead of a handout. Another studies the effects of an innovative effort in Takoma, Washington, where the local public housing authority provides housing vouchers to community college students with the intent to improve graduation rates, with the thinking that you're more likely to earn a college degree if you have stable housing, and if you do earn a college degree, you're less likely in the future to be in need of public housing supports. Sara is also leading a new Kresge-funded study examining the impacts of free or reduced-price public transit passes on community college student outcomes, given that transit can be a huge expense for many college students. If you'd like to hear more from her about efforts to address college students' unmet basic needs, I hope you'll join us at a breakout session right after lunch about what colleges can and should be doing to transform themselves to meet real student needs. Sara is the trusted advisor to think tanks, to policymakers, and to many of us GFE members here in the room. She's testified before the U.S. Senate's Help Committee, spoken at the White House Domestic Policy Council, and is about to speak to us, and I hope we will all just ignore the irony of discussing food insecurity while we have this elaborate, lovely lunch. But with that, please help me welcome Dr. Sara Goldrick-Rab.
Okay, good afternoon. Thank you all so much for having me. I do appear to not have my clicker. Don't know if they were going to put one up here, but I will go ahead and get started while I await that and appreciate it. So I want to thank you all for having me this afternoon, giving me a chance to share some thoughts with you. It was wonderful to be introduced by Caroline. The Kresge Foundation has really been a major supporter of our work. I also want to acknowledge that there are many of us who are working in the field of basic needs and security and wouldn't be able to be doing so if it wasn't for other foundations, including Ascendium, the Lumina Foundation, the Trellis Foundation, Arnold Ventures, and Greater Texas, among many others, who have taken seriously the idea that we need to go beyond the usual suspects when we think about supports for today's college students. I want to start by helping you think a bit about why students today are in college. And I think that it's important that we ground ourselves there because there is so much chatter about how misguided or uninformed or not knowledgeable today's students are, that's really not aligned with the data that we have found from our research studies over the last 20 years. We don't find that today's college students are wandering, are academically adrift, or are otherwise unaware of the promise of higher education. But rather, what we find is that the stakes for them are so high and the available supports so relatively low. They come to college seeking not only better lives for themselves, but also for the many other people in their lives. You know, the USGAO recently issued a remarkable report that showed that 4.3 million college students have children. And the report further shows that that number is probably an undercount because of the number of young siblings, cousins, brothers and sisters, of course, others who are living in the houses and are not counted as people with dependent children. These folks are coming seeking not only to get what we might call a good job, but really to have what they think of as a decent life. A life marked by more stability. A life where you can be sure from month to month that not only the paycheck will come, but that you'll be able to keep the lights on. I want to encourage you to think about those motivations and all that they stand for when you think about today's students. My team has found it important to reframe language around how we talk about today's students to emphasize the strength of what these individuals bring to the table. And also to acknowledge that while it is so incredibly common to call college students kids, we really need to stop doing that. And I'm not going to call out anybody in the room. I know many of you here. I know we do it. I know it's easy to do it. And I know that every year I get older and they still seem to stay the same age in my classroom. But in many respects, they're not kids. And I wish that they were, because kids get to be carefree. This generation, this latest generation entering higher education, might be most appropriately called the austerity generation. A generation that has grown up at a time with fewer supports than ever before. They've survived so much, and they get to college already having been adultified from a young age, having to help with their parents' bills, having to worry about what's going on at home even as they try to do what we call a transition to adulthood. So my team calls these individuals real college students. And we put a hashtag in front of it because hashtag activism is one really useful way to change a conversation. It's so important that we understand the variety of circumstances undergirding the lives of real college students if we really intend to help them succeed. So let me take a moment and explain what I call the new economics of college. The new economics of college are a sharp break from the past, and in particular, they're a break from the time in American history where we created the current financial aid system. So think about the 5 things on the screen. The first one is the one that you probably talk the most about, especially in your dinner table conversations: rising prices. And normally, if you're listening, for example, to your governor, you're going to hear about tuition. But we now understand, better than ever, and partly thanks to hard work from the Lumina Foundation, that there are a lot of costs that go well beyond tuition. So for example, we know that the rising price of rent, the rising price of food, the rising price of transportation, the rising price of healthcare, all of these things are in fact college attainment issues. And we understand that even as we try to fight to preserve something like the federal Pell Grant, or your local favorite state need-based grant, the purchasing power of those grants has continued to fall. And that certainly matters, and it's issue number 1. But the other 4 things get a lot less discussion. So consider for a moment that the prices have actually been rising for a long time, and yet we didn't see the same outcry as prices went up in the 70s, in the 80s, and in the 90s. Why is that? Well, it turns out that it's really about what was happening to American families at the time, which was that as prices were rising, they were actually also still getting ahead. Now, certainly there's always been inequality, so not everyone has always gotten ahead at the same rate. But in general, in the 1980s, you could expect month after month after month and year after year after year to be doing at least a little bit better. So if tuition went up, people thought they could handle it. And in the 90s, that trend continued. But when we get to this century, we see a major change. Many of our families have actually lost ground. And that's particularly true for African American families, who saw their wealth decimated by half since the recession. So when you contrast that decimation of wealth with continually rising college prices, you can see why families are getting more and more upset. It also helps you understand why today's real college students cannot turn to their families like they used to, simply to fill in the gaps. The third issue is something that we in higher ed don't pay enough attention to, and that's this thing that we like to call the safety net. Now, be honest with me. I'm sure many of you right now are watching the debates over the Higher Education Act reauthorization. And today I understand there are even further developments. But how many of you, back in 1995, when this nation was considering revising what we call welfare policy, how many of you were paying close attention? Look around you. Okay, so there are some folks in this room who were, and it was probably, gosh, it looks like less than 10%. That policy reshaped access to higher education, particularly for low-income women and for Black and brown women across this country. But most of us were not noticing. Most of us were not part of the discussion as the work requirements were instituted and it included indications that education did not count as work, pushing people out of the nation's community colleges, and as Tracy McMillan Cottom has argued, pushing them towards the for-profit sector. We similarly were not paying attention as a community in education when changes were made to the Farm Bill that made it harder for students to access SNAP, a very important support that has helped them ensure that they can eat so that they can learn. So these changes over time mean that some of the policies that used to support educators now actually work against them. Another really important issue has to do with that famous pastime that we seem to hold so dear, this idea that you should work your way through college. Now, there's a lot of attention to statistics that say that so many of today's students are working, and that's true. But what those statistics don't show is the real struggles that they have with work that students in the past did not have. Struggles that come from changes to our labor force. So consider, for example, that as the competition for jobs that don't require a college degree has heightened, that has made it harder for our college students to actually get those jobs. That they often go up against many other workers who have much more flexible schedules as they try to get a part-time job. And they deal with employers who will often take 30 hours a week and spread it across 3 employees instead of giving it all to one. We're actually learning that if we ask the questions right, we can see that many of today's college students who are not employed are not telling us that they don't want to work or that they don't need the money. They're actually telling us they cannot find a job that they're seeking. That's unemployment. It costs money, it doesn't pay the bills, and it's demoralizing. So working our way through college simply looks different than it used to. It also looks different because the minimum wage has not increased, because the tipped minimum wage has declined, and because in that most famous of all jobs, waiting tables during college, people now tip on credit cards instead of in cash. That means that people take home less money. The last issue, and this is perhaps the most controversial, but I'm hoping you'll go with me on this, is that today's colleges are underfunded. Now, it's hard to dispute the clear fact that on a per-student basis, state funding for public higher education is way down. There are others who argue that today's colleges get more than enough money to meet students' needs. But I'd argue that if you compare across colleges, if you want to know what's required for an adequate education, we ought to look to the places with very high graduation rates. You'll tend to see them spend upwards of $30 to $40 to $50 to even, if you're Amherst, $100,000 per year per student. And if you look at the nation's community colleges, you'll tend to see spending between $3,000 to around $10,000 per student, which suggests that we get what we pay for. So we send underprepared, under-financially suited students from under-resourced families into under-resourced institutions at a time when there's very little support from public policy. And then we go one step further, and we take a set of issues that disproportionately affect people who don't come from wealth, and we silence them. So if you look at the quote on the screen, this is from a young man that my team interviewed in Milwaukee in 2008. He was 18, he was going to a public university, and we asked him a simple question. How's it going in college? Not how's your financial aid, right? Not how are your bills? How is it going in college? And his response was all about his challenges paying for his mom's expenses. I guarantee you that in high school he was doing the same thing. When he got to college, he understood that if he didn't help keep the lights on at home, his younger brothers and sisters wouldn't be okay. The fact that he had to go to the Student Financial Aid Office and take out a federal loan in order to pay those expenses was a reality and associated with a higher probability of staying in school. But according to our federal financial aid system, that is a non-educational expense and not something he's even supposed to talk about. A deeply uncomfortable topic. We put all of this together, the new economics, the issues that we silence, the realities that students face that we don't even let them speak of. And you can see why it's been so easy and so convenient, frankly, in many ways, to forget about Maslow. Now, again, we believe the conversation has started to shift in recent years, thanks in large part to many investments to reveal this conversation, but I want to first make sure that we're all on the same page. When I use a term like food insecurity, I want to make sure that we all understand this is not a fancy word for I don't want to eat ramen. Okay, that's not what's happened here. We don't have a national dialogue because we suddenly want to make eating ramen an issue. The United States Department of Agriculture measures food insecurity across this country and around the world using a validated instrument. It comes in a couple of flavors, and we've tried them all. There's a 2-item, a 6, a 10, and an 18, and my team works with the 18-item scale because it is the most precise and because it is effective, especially for people with children. We get to assess the food insecurity of the parent, the student who is responding, and of the dependents living in the household. The way it works is they're asked a set of questions about the things that have happened to them in the last 30 days, and for each of the items you see on the screen, they're asked whether they never experience this, sometimes experience this, or often experience this. If they say yes, for example, the food I bought didn't last and I didn't have money to buy more, and that sometimes happened to me or often happened to me in the last 30 days, then they get a point for that one. They only proceed through the other items, which increase in severity, if they say yes to the earlier items. Now, the USDA does not weight the more severe items more heavily than the less severe items. That's their decision, and there have been national scientific panels that have debated it. We've left it alone for now and simply followed their guidance, adding up the score and placing it on a scale. Now, as you can see up there, if a student says, yes, some of these things have happened to me, but only a few of them. So for example, they might not be eating a nutritionally adequate diet, and they might be worried about running out of money for food. They get a score of perhaps 2. And they'll be placed in the marginal food security category, and they will not be named food insecure in the statistics that I'm about to present. Okay? So there are some ways that they can struggle, and I'm not saying that that kind of worry or not eating a nutritious diet doesn't have effects on them. We actually do have some evidence that being even in the marginal category is not a great place to be. But it is done on a scale. We've also been looking at another significant item that stems from these new economics, the issue of housing insecurity. Some people call this near homelessness, recognizing that oftentimes people are just one kind of bad piece of luck away from actually being pushed into homelessness. And the issues that we measure under housing insecurity, again, come from the federal government and include things like being at risk of eviction because you're not paying your rent, or being at risk of having your utilities turned off because you're not paying for those, or leaving your home because you didn't feel safe, or moving very frequently, or receiving a summons to housing court, these sorts of issues. We go a step further and we measure homelessness. Now, homelessness is a really difficult topic. It's especially hard for higher ed because we have convinced ourselves that this thing called couch surfing sounds like fun, right? Think about it. You heard somebody's couch surfing and you think, well, they got different friends and they're just hanging out on the weekends. You know, it turns out, and we had to look at this ourselves and we had to be convinced of it, looking at the data, the couch surfing's not fun. The couch surfing more often looks like Mary, a woman at the Community College of Philadelphia who I spent 2 years following around as she tried to get her degree while raising a 9-year-old child. They had an apartment. The apartment was barely affordable, but they were living there successfully until a hole developed in the floor. And when she told the landlord that he needed to fix the hole to make it safe for herself and her child, he said no and evicted her. She wasn't able to find another affordable place, and so she started to have them stay on the couches of relatives, and 1 month became another month and another month. And Mary spent her time in class thinking not about the subject matter in front of her, but rather about where they were going to find the next couch. The other thing that Mary taught me, and I really wouldn't have known this if I hadn't gotten this close look at her, is that when you're couch surfing, it's fairly common for the host to tell you, yes, you can sleep on my couch, but don't show up until the evening and leave first thing in the morning. And when you're there, don't raise my expenses by doing things like opening the refrigerator or turning on the lights. You're not really a guest. And that increases the stress, and as you can imagine, the feeling that you are not welcome. Now, my team for almost a decade did not include couch surfing in our definition of homelessness and instead used the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development's definition, which excludes it. But we have more recently come to include it for the reasons I've just described, and it is in alignment with the K-12 definition under the McKinney-Vento. How many students are affected? It's very hard to know. The only way we know is by asking their colleges for permission to survey them. And if you think about it, the real bias there comes from which colleges say yes and which colleges say no. So I want to point out to you the data I'll show you in a moment comes disproportionately from the broad and open access public institutions around the United States that are attended by almost 3 in 4 college students. Who is not here? Most of the private schools, particularly the elite ones, and the for-profits. So as you look at the estimates, I want you to consider both. Maybe the for-profits have higher rates and they're not here. Maybe that is or is not outweighed by the exclusion of the Ivies. But I'm showing you data from 167,000 respondents at 269 institutions. And this spring, we'll be releasing our 5th report, which will include data from almost 400,000 students at over 500 schools. Here are our estimates. As you can see, these numbers approach around 50%, particularly for the 2-year sector, a little over a third for the 4-year sector. The housing insecurity estimates are sometimes higher than the food security ones, and the homelessness rates on the low end don't include couch surfing and on the high end do. We can argue over whether these numbers are right or wrong. What I want you to think about is how wrong do they have to be for us to say this is a non-issue? And how many decades went by in American higher education while we paid attention to other issues without addressing this most basic one? I want to just give you a sense of disparities. Bottom line, yes, there are disparities. Bottom line, even the white kids are affected. And when I say kids, you know I don't like the term. But even the youngest ones, okay? They look like my kids, they look like your kids. It is everybody. It is the kind of folks, especially, who are left out of the financial aid system, LGBTQ youth who are told your parents' income counts on the FAFSA, even when you don't have access to the money. People with children, people who've served in the military, people who've transitioned out of foster care, people who have transitioned from prison to college. All of them. The federal government has reviewed the evidence and, bottom line, issued a report in January that said, indeed, campus food insecurity is a major issue. We're still waiting on the GAO to take a look at the homeless college student issue. They particularly underlined the failure of federal programs to actually support these students, noting the importance of connecting them with the SNAP program. We find these students are deeply committed academically. They are studying, they are going to class, they are working or seeking work. What they are not doing at the same rates as other students is sleeping. Anyone in here who's endured sleep deprivation, had a small infant in their homes, knows exactly what that means. The saddest part for me comes from our qualitative data, our interviews, which reveal that the person to blame, in their view, for these problems is themselves. As these students tell their stories, you will almost always come back to the bottom line, which is that they believe that their poverty, their troubles, are their personal failures. That, I think, is the thing we must change first. And if we're going to work together to do better, and I believe that we can, we have to start by reminding ourselves and them that students are humans first. It might seem obvious, but it is not happening in higher education. We treat students as if they come to school with all of these things already in place, otherwise how could they be there? But we have to remember that we've designed intentionally an accessible higher education system, and that these troubles can happen to almost anyone. We need to ensure that programmatic investments reflect these realities. I want you to think about what happens. You heard about the Takoma program that we're studying. When we first encountered the Takoma program, they were restricting access to this important housing support to students with high grades. And using our evidence, we asked them to change that. The high grades are so hard to get when you're homeless. The high grades are, if anything, an expected outcome of the program. We need to ensure that these real college students are able to lead the change. When I say invest in real college student leadership, I mean more than having them tell their stories. We need to learn from them. These are the folks that should be designing the programs. We're learning the hard way in many cases when they are left out of the programming. And I know that's true in a variety of settings, but this is so urgent a situation that we need to ensure that they are the designers at the table from day one. We need to support colleges that are doing hard work that goes beyond single programs. Food pantries have a seductive power. They help us to believe that we have done something. They provide a little bit of food. But a culture of caring, such as that being implemented at Amarillo College under the leadership of Dr. Russell Lowry Hart, is doing something radically different. Please come to our next session so that you can hear about the work that they're doing to scale what they call a culture of caring. It takes real time and investment, but we expect the dividends to be substantial. I believe that one of the lowest hanging fruit out there to help address students' basic needs is emergency aid. It helps in two different ways. It helps communicate to students that a college cares and doesn't want to see them suffer, and it is flexible and can be used for a variety of challenges that they face. But I also think that we need to revise how we are currently distributing emergency aid, because in far too many cases, staff are essentially asking students to prove their poverty and perform it in front of them. It's stigmatizing. It's traumatizing, including for the staff. I've got some websites up there for a couple of different models you can take a look at. Happy to answer questions later about those. And we also have to invest in evidence to inform effective advocacy. There are about a half dozen bills pending right now in Congress around campus food insecurity. We need to know a lot more about what should be in those bills to ensure that those investments pay off. We need to empower people to be in the room with those legislators to inform the discussion. If you think about the traditional higher ed lobby in DC right now and the traditional advocates, they're great at talking about the troubles with financial aid, and they don't know much about students' basic needs. We need to change that so that we can get to a better set of policies. My team has a website that is filled with information. It gives you strategies, it gives you research, and it gives you ways to connect both to the students who are doing this work, to the colleges and the policymakers who are doing this work, and of course to build a broader community. One of the things that we're trying to do around the country is to support the grassroots efforts that are taking place. And that, I think, is highlighted in Kresge's investments, which allow us to work with some of the communities that are coming up with their own solutions. In many ways, these problems, they should be easy to solve. Food is available. We need to fix distribution. Housing is, of course, a thornier issue, but there are some really obvious broken pieces in how policy is done. If we can lean into those efforts, I'm convinced that we're going to see increases in college attainment, particularly for the folks that you care most about. So thank you so much for having me. I appreciate your attention and your consideration.